Have you ever noticed how even today we're still kind of wrestling with these like really big questions like what is real? How do we know anything? What's the point of it all?
Yeah, definitely. It's like these philosophical puzzles keep popping up again and again throughout history.
And it's interesting because if you trace some of these ideas back, you find out that philosophers from way back, like hundreds of years ago, were already trying to figure this stuff out.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
They were grappling with some of the same fundamental questions that we're still debating today.
So today we're going to jump back in time, almost 1,000 years, to explore the work of this philosopher named William of Champeaux.
Oh, William of Champeaux, yeah. He's not exactly a household name, but he was a major figure in the 11th and 12th centuries, a
Yeah.
really influential thinker.
So why don't you tell us a bit about him? Who was this guy and what made him so important?
Well, he lived from around 1070 to 1122, and he was a leading philosopher and theologian of his day.
Oh, wow. So right in the heart of the Middle Ages.
Right. And he was known for his strong commitment to realism, both in logic and metaphysics.
Realism. So he was all about how the things we think and talk about have real existence, not just in our minds.
Exactly. He believed that universals, like the concept of redness or humanity, weren't just mental constructs, but actually had some kind of real existence.
Now, that's a deep rabbit hole, but we'll
Yeah.
get to that, I promise. What else? Tell us more about his life.
Well, he held prestigious teaching positions, first at the Cathedral School of Notre Dame in Paris, and later at the Monastery of Saint Victor, which was a major center of learning at the time.
Wow, so he was right in the thick of things, shaping the intellectual landscape of Europe.
He was, and he had a huge impact on his students. And speaking of students, this is where things get a bit spicy. He had this famous and at times pretty heated debate with one of his star pupils, Peter Abelard.
Oh, yeah, Abelard. We've talked about him before on the show. Quite the character, and not one to shy away from a good philosophical brawl. What was the beef between them?
Well, they disagreed pretty vehemently on the nature of universals. Abelard took a more nominalist approach, arguing that universals were more like names or concepts we use to group similar things together, while William, as we mentioned, was a staunch realist, insisting that these universals had some sort of independent reality.
So basically, Abelard thought universals were in our heads, and William thought they were out there in the world. A real clash of the philosophical titans.
It was, and the debate didn't end there. It actually carried on even after William's death, with Abelard getting into it with William's protege, Bernard of Clairvaux.
Bernard of Clairvaux, another big name. So this debate over universals really set the stage for a lot of the philosophical developments in the Middle Ages. It's like a chain reaction of ideas.
It was. And our goal today is to delve into William of Champeaux's philosophical world, to see how he approached these big questions and how his thought laid the groundwork for later thinkers.
So we're going back in time, putting on our philosophical detective hats to try and piece together his system of thought. But as with any historical figure, we're dealing with limited sources, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're relying on fragments, accounts from his contemporaries, and in some cases, writings that are specifically trying to refute him. So it's like putting together a puzzle with some pieces missing and others that might not quite fit.
So we'll have to be careful, weigh the evidence, and maybe even speculate a bit to get a fuller picture of William's thought.
Exactly. And remember, the sources we have are often coming from people who strongly disagreed with him, so we have to read between the lines and try to understand his position in its own right.
Okay, so let's dive into the deep end, shall we? You mentioned universals earlier and how William was this big-time realist. Let's unpack that a bit. What exactly did his realism entail?
Well, he had two main theories on universals, actually.
Oh, too. So he revised his views over time.
He did, likely in response to the criticisms he was getting, especially from Abelard.
Makes sense. You got to refine your ideas when you're constantly sparring with sharp minds.
Exactly. So his first theory is called material essence realism.
Yeah.
And it's the one he's most famous for, but also the one that got him into the most trouble.
Okay, material essence realism. Let's break it down. What's the core idea here?
All right, so imagine you're William, and you're looking at the world, trying to figure out what's really going on. You see all these different individual things, right? Trees, rocks, people, animals.
Yeah, a whole messy jumble of stuff.
But William, being a good philosopher, wants to find some kind of order, some underlying unity in all this diversity.
So he's not satisfied with just the surface appearance of things. He wants to dig deeper, see what's holding it all together.
Exactly. And he starts with Aristotle, who had this idea of 10 categories, these fundamental ways of classifying things: substance, quantity, quality, relation, and so on.
Okay, the categories, we know those.
Okay.
So how do these categories connect to William's theory of universals?
Well, William takes these categories and says, okay, each of these categories corresponds to a fundamental essence, a real thing that exists in the world.
So for him, it's not just that we use the category substance to describe certain things, but there's an actual essence of substance out there.
That's right. And this essence is universal, meaning it's present in every single instance of a substance.
So every rock, every tree, every person, they all share the same essence of substance.
Exactly. It's like a universal ingredient, a fundamental building block that makes something a substance.
That's a pretty bold claim. But how does he account for the fact that all these substances are clearly different from each other?
Well, he says that these fundamental essences get shaped and differentiated into more specific types of things by adding what he calls differentia.
Differentia. So these are the specific characteristics that distinguish one kind of thing from another.
Right. So, for example, you have the essence of animal, which is present in all animals.
Okay, so every animal, from a slug to an elephant, shares this essence of animal.
But then you add the differentia, rationality, and that forms the species human.
So the essence of animal is like the raw material, and rationality is the shaping force that makes it human.
Precisely. And then to create individual humans, you add even more specific characteristics, what he calls accidental forms. These are the things that make you, and me, me.
So my hair color, my height, my personality, those are all accidental forms.
Exactly. They're not essential to my being human, but they make me the unique individual I am.
And William actually has this great quote that sums up this whole process. A species is nothing other than a formed genus. An individual, nothing other than a formed species.
Perfect summary. So you can see how he's building up from these fundamental essences to more and more specific types of things.
But here's the thing. If all humans share the same material essence of humanity, how can we be distinct individuals?
Well, that's where the accidental part comes in. William says that while the essence is the same, the accidents that individuate us are different.
So the essence is like the shared core, and the accidents are the unique variations on that theme.
Exactly. And he argues that we can use our reason to strip away the accidents and contemplate the pure essence, even though in reality, nothing exists without its accidents.
It's like a thought experiment. We can imagine the essence in its pure form even if we never encounter it that way in the real world.
Right. He's emphasizing that there's a real shared foundation underlying all the individual differences. Now, as you might imagine, this theory generated a lot of controversy.
Yeah, I can see how that might raise some eyebrows. All humans sharing the same essence sounds a bit mind-bending.
It did, and Abelard was one of the most vocal critics. His objections were so strong that William actually developed a second theory of universals called indifference realism.
Oh, so he revised his views in light of the criticism.
That's intellectually honest. I got to give him credit for that. So what's this indifference realism all about? How's it different from his earlier view? Well, with indifference realism, he shifts the focus away from shared material essences and puts more emphasis on the distinctness of individuals.
Okay, so no more shared stuff that makes us all human.
Not exactly. He's still interested in how we can talk about things being the same in some sense, but he digs deeper into what we actually mean by that word.
So he's getting into the nitty-gritty of language, how we use words to carve up the world.
Precisely. He says there are actually different ways we can talk about things being one or same. We might mean they're numerically identical, like two names for the same person.
Like calling someone Elizabeth and Liz, same person, different names.
Right. But we might also mean they're similar in some respect without being numerically identical.
So like saying two apples are the same because they're both red.
Exactly. And he uses the example of Plato and Socrates to illustrate this distinction.
Okay, so how does he use Plato and Socrates to explain indifference realism?
Well, he says we can talk about them being the same in that they're both men.
They share the characteristic of being human, but they're obviously two different individuals.
Right. And he argues that this sameness doesn't come from them sharing a single identical essence of humanity.
So what's the source of their sameness if it's not a shared essence?
He says it's because they don't differ in the respect of being human. In other words, they both possess the characteristic of being a man, even though they're otherwise distinct individuals.
So the similarity is more about what they have in common rather than some underlying substance they share.
Exactly. And this leads him to this interesting conclusion that each individual is, in a way, both universal and particular.
So how can something be both universal and particular at the same time?
Well, considered as an individual, each thing is unique with its own distinct essence. But when you consider its general nature, its being a man or being a tree, that's where the universal aspect comes in.
So the individual is particular in its specific existence, but universal in its sharing of certain general characteristics.
Precisely. And he says that this is how we can have many men who are all one in their being men, even though they're wholly diverse in essence as individuals.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. It's a subtle distinction, but I can see how it's a way to account for both the unity and diversity of things in the world.
Exactly. It's a way to preserve the reality of individual things
Yeah.
while still recognizing the ways they can be grouped and classified together.
So it's like a balancing act between the particular and the universal. Now, I'm curious, how did this indifference realism go over with his critics, particularly Abelard? Did it satisfy them, or did they still find things to object to?
Well, Abelard was never one to back down from a good philosophical debate, and he certainly had his reservations about indifference realism as well. He still questioned how William could account for the real similarities between things without appealing to some kind of shared essence.
So even with this revised theory, William still hadn't completely escaped Abelard's critical gaze.
It seems not. But that's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? The constant back and forth, the refining of ideas through rigorous debate.
It's like a never-ending game of intellectual ping-pong.
Exactly. And these debates are what push our understanding forward, even if we never arrive at definitive answers. Now, while we're on the topic of William's thought, I think it's time we shift gears and delve into another fascinating area of his work, his contributions to logic and the philosophy of language.
Okay, logic and language. Now, I've heard that William had some pretty interesting ideas about how words work, how they connect to the world, and how they allow us to reason and make arguments.
He did. He was a really sharp thinker when it came to language. And it's important to remember that for medieval philosophers, logic wasn't just some abstract formal system, but a tool for understanding the world, a way to unlock the secrets of reality.
So logic was deeply intertwined with metaphysics, with the study of being.
Precisely. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of William's logical writings that have survived in their original form.
Oh, so we're back to playing philosophical detective, piecing together his ideas from fragments and secondhand accounts.
We are. But even from these limited sources, we can see that he was grappling with some really fundamental questions about signification, about how words get their meaning and how they relate to the things they refer to.
Signification, that's the heart of the matter, right? How do these squiggles on paper or sounds in the air actually manage to convey meaning about the world?
Exactly. And William, being a realist, had a very particular take on this. He wasn't content with just saying that meaning is arbitrary, that it's just a matter of convention.
So he thought there was a deeper connection between words and the world, a connection grounded in reality.
He did. He actually believed there was a kind of affinity between words and things, a natural correspondence between the structure of language and the structure of reality. He even went so far as to say that words draw their properties from things.
So the meaning of a word, for him, wasn't just something we imposed on it, but something that flowed from the nature of the thing itself.
Exactly. And this led him to a pretty radical claim, one that got him into some trouble, especially with Abelard.
Trouble. I'm sensing a pattern here. Abelard just couldn't resist poking holes in William's ideas, could he?
It seems not. But that's what makes their exchanges so fascinating. So this radical claim that William made was that only words that are imposed to name actually existing things are truly significant.
Okay, let me make sure I understand. He's saying that if a word doesn't refer to something that actually exists in the world, it's meaningless.
That's essentially it. He even gives some examples. He says that word is significant, which is imposed on an existing thing, like man. That word is not significant, which is imposed on a non-existing thing, like chimera, litrix, and hercoservices.
Okay, I can see where this is going. We use words all the time to talk about things that don't exist, like mythical creatures or fictional characters. Is he saying we're just spouting gibberish when we do that?
Not quite.
Yeah.
He recognizes that we do talk about these things and that our language seems to function just fine.
So how does he explain that?
He introduces this concept of figurative signification.
Figurative signification. So it's like a way of talking about non-existent things without actually granting them real existence.
Exactly. He says that when we say something like chimeras are imaginary, we're not actually talking about chimeras as real entities.
Because for him, chimeras don't exist, so the word chimera can't have a direct, literal meaning.
Right. But we are talking about something that does exist, which is the mental image or concept of a chimera.
So the sentence is really about a mental state, not about a mythical creature.
Precisely. And he gives another example. Homer is a poet. He says this sentence doesn't refer to a currently existing Homer since he lived in the past.
So how does he make sense of that sentence?
He says it's figuratively referring to Homer's works, which do still exist. So the sentence is really about the enduring legacy of Homer's poetry, not about Homer himself as a living, breathing person.
Okay, so figurative signification is a way to talk about non-existent things by grounding the meaning in something that does exist, like mental states or physical artifacts.
That's the gist of it. Now, there's also this debate about whether William thought words signify all the things they were ever imposed to name.
All the things. So, like, if I use the word dog, is he saying I'm somehow referring to every single dog that's ever existed?
That's how Abelard interpreted it, and he used this to criticize William, suggesting it would lead to absurd conclusions.
I can see how that might be problematic, trying to cram the entire history of dogdom into a single word.
Right, but it's not entirely clear if that's really what William had in mind. It might be a case of Abelard oversimplifying or even distorting William's position to make it easier to attack.
So there's some scholarly debate about what William really meant, always tricky when you're dealing with limited sources.
It is. Now, another area where William gets into some interesting territory is with infinite terms, words like non-man.
Infinite terms, so these are words that refer to everything that's not a particular thing.
Exactly. And William says these terms have a threefold signification. They can be understood affirmatively, negatively, or in what he considers the correct way.
Okay, 3 ways. Let's unpack those. What's the affirmative interpretation?
Affirmatively, non-man would signify everything that is not a man, which is a pretty vast category.
Basically everything in the universe except for humans.
Right. But he rejects the negative interpretation, which would say that non-man signifies nothing at all.
Why does he reject that view?
Because for him, if a word signifies nothing, it's meaningless. It doesn't have a role to play in language.
So he needs a way to give infinite terms a meaningful role.
Exactly. And that's where his correct interpretation comes in.
Okay, so what's this correct way of understanding infinite terms?
He says that while terms like animal and man signify the same existing things by direct imposition, terms like non-animal and non-man signify those same sets of things by remotion.
Remotion. So it's like they're carving out a space in the conceptual landscape by excluding certain things.
Precisely. He even says that animal and man signify the very same thing, non-animal and non-man by remotion. And because of this remotive imposition, you can't just substitute any non-animal term for non-man and keep the same meaning or truth value. He uses the example of stone. Even though a stone is a non-animal, it's not the same as saying non-man.
So the relationship between the infinite term and its corresponding positive term is crucial.
Exactly. Now, Abelard, of course, had some things to say about this, too. He criticized William for seemingly allowing terms like rational and rational animal to signify the same thing.
But wouldn't those terms refer to different sets of things? Rational could include things like angels or disembodied minds, while rational animal is more specific to humans.
You would think so. But William seemed to hold the view that if the actually existing things signified by both terms were the same, then the terms themselves could be considered to have the same signification, even if their linguistic expressions were different.
So again, his focus is on the real-world reference of words, not just on their linguistic structure.
Exactly. And this brings us to another interesting aspect of William's philosophy of language, his theory of how quality terms signify, words like white and black.
Okay, so how do these color terms work differently?
He says they signify in 2 modes, by imposition and by representation. They signify the substance they're applied to by imposition, meaning they're directly attached to that substance.
So like saying this apple is white, the word white is directly modifying the apple.
Right. But he says they signify the qualities themselves, whiteness and blackness, by representation.
So they're not just about the object, but also about the abstract quality that inheres in the object.
Exactly. He's trying to capture both the concrete and the abstract aspects of how we talk about qualities.
And Abelard actually acknowledged this distinction in William's thought.
He did. He noted that for William, a word like white denotes the subject, but fundamentally determines the quality inhering in that subject, what he called the fundamentum.
So even in their disagreements, there's a recognition of the subtlety and complexity of William's ideas.
Definitely. And this attention to detail carries over into his analysis of sentences. He argues that sentences have both a grammatical sense and a dialectical sense.
Okay, two senses. I'm intrigued. What's the difference between the grammatical sense and the dialectical sense of a sentence?
Well, take the sentence, Socrates is white. In the grammatical sense, the verb is functioning as an intransitive copula of essence, meaning it's linking the subject and predicate as denoting the same thing.
So grammatically speaking, it's saying that Socrates and whiteness are identical.
Exactly. But in the dialectical sense, that same verb is marking a predication of inherence.
So it's saying that the quality of whiteness inheres in Socrates, but they're not necessarily identical.
Precisely. And he says that the truth or falsity of sentence ultimately resides in the grammatical sense.
So the grammarian is focused on the precise logical relationship, while the dialectician is more interested in the broader relationship of predication.
Right. And William also put forward this idea of maximal propositions, these really general logical principles that contain or implicitly signify all the more specific propositions that fall under them.
It's like a top-down view of logic, starting with these big, sweeping statements that encompass a whole range of more specific truths.
Exactly. And he argues that it's the more precise, contained sentences that provide the real inferential force in specific arguments.
So the maxim gives you the general framework, but the specific sentences do the heavy lifting when it comes to actually making inferences.
Right. And again, this connects back to his realism, his belief that logic is grounded in the real relationships between things in the world.
He's not just playing with words, he's trying to capture the structure of reality itself.
Exactly. Now, he also applied this realism to his analysis of categorical sentences, the A-E-I-O sentences that Aristotle laid out.
The classic logical forms, all S or P, no S or P, some S or P, and so on.
Right. He classified these sentences based on what he called the matter of the sentence.
The matter of the sentence. So this is about the kind of relationship between the subject and predicate, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He identified three types of matter: natural, contingent, and remotive.
Okay. Break those down for us. What's natural matter?
Natural matter is where the predicate universally inheres in the subject, like the classic example, all men are animals.
So in every case, if something is a man, it's also an animal. There's a necessary connection there.
Right. Then there's contingent matter, where the predicate inheres in the subject, but not necessarily in every case.
So like saying all men are white, some men are white, but not all of them.
Precisely. And finally, there's remotive matter, where the predicate in no way inheres in the subject, like all men are stones.
Yeah, obviously false. There's no connection there at all.
Right. And he argued that the validity of certain logical inferences depends on the type of matter involved.
So the kind of relationship between the concepts affects what conclusions you can validly draw.
Exactly. Now, speaking of inferences, this brings us to another really interesting aspect of William's logic, his theory of loci.
Loci, or topics. Now, we've talked about topics before on the show, those general principles or places you can go to find arguments. How did William approach them?
Well, he took this traditional idea of topics and gave it his own realist spin.
So of course he did. Realism seems to be the thread that runs through all of his thought.
It really does. He wasn't content with just treating topics as linguistic devices. He wanted to ground them in the real world and the actual connections between things.
So for him, the loci weren't just abstract rules, but reflections of how reality is structured.
Exactly. He actually narrowed down the traditional Boethian topics and introduced new ones, specifically loci from the subject, and predicate for categorical arguments.
So he's fine-tuning the system, making it more precise and connected to the way he understands the world.
Precisely. And he sometimes uses the terms locus and medium interchangeably, referring to the link between the extremes of an argument.
So it's not just about the middle term in a syllogism, but about whatever establishes the connection between the starting point and the conclusion.
Right. And he goes even further, calling the locus the argument itself.
So the locus isn't just a tool for finding arguments, it's the very heart of the argument, what gives it its force.
Exactly. And he's very clear about this, saying the same thing is the argument and the locus, according to Master W, but the locus is the force of the argument.
There's that realism again. The force of the argument comes from the real-world connection, not just from the arrangement of words.
Exactly. Now, in his earlier work, he sometimes referred to loci as words, denoting things or relations. But in his later writings, he makes a clear distinction between the word, the understanding in the mind, and the thing itself.
So the locus is ultimately the thing itself, or the real relationship between things, not just a linguistic representation.
Right. And he identifies different types of loci for categorical syllogisms. There are loci from the subject, from the predicate, from both, and from the whole proposition.
So it's like he's mapping out all the different ways that real-world connections can ground logical inferences.
Exactly. And he gives this example. All men are animals. No animal is a stone. Therefore, no man is a stone.
Okay, the classic syllogism. What's the locus here?
He says it's animal, the predicate of the first premise, which is functioning as the locus from the predicate. It's the link between man and stone.
So it's the shared characteristic of being an animal that allows us to connect men and stones, even though they seem very different.
Exactly. And he argues that there are these underlying maximal propositions that contain these relationships.
So it's like the specific syllogism is just a particular instance of a more general truth about how things are connected in the world.
Precisely. And he applies a similar approach to hypothetical syllogisms, identifying loci like from the consequent or from equals.
So he's systematically grounding different types of arguments in these real-world relationships.
He is. And this, of course, is where Abelard comes in with his criticisms.
I was wondering when he'd show up, always ready with a counter-argument.
He was. He objected to William's theory of loci, sometimes interpreting them as if they were formal logical rules, and then trying to show that they led to contradictions.
So again, a clash between a more realist and a more nominalist approach to logic.
It was. Now let's move on to another fascinating area of William's thought. His views on modality, on possibility and necessity.
Okay, modality. Now this is where things can get really slippery, even for seasoned philosophers.
It can. And William's position on this is a bit tricky to pin down because we're relying mainly on Abelard's account. And you know how that goes.
Yeah, Abelard might have had his own agenda, presenting William's views in a way that made them easier to attack.
Precisely. So according to Abelard, William believed that all modality is didicto, meaning it's about the way we talk about things, about the sense of sentences.
So it's not about things themselves being possible or necessary, but about our statements about those things.
Right. Abelard quotes William as saying, when we say it is possible or necessary that Socrates runs, we are saying that what the sentence Socrates runs says is possible or necessary.
So the modality is attached to the proposition, not to Socrates himself.
Exactly. But there's some debate about whether this is an accurate representation of William's view. Some scholars think it might be an oversimplification or even a distortion.
So there's some uncertainty, which is not surprising given our limited sources.
It's not. And there are other anonymous texts from the period that suggest a slightly different view, where modal terms modify the signification of other words.
So like instead of saying it's possible that Socrates is a bishop, you would say something like Socrates is a possible bishop.
Right, and this would imply that modal terms are actually changing the meaning of the words they modify.
So it's not just about the sentence as a whole, but about how these modal terms are affecting the individual words within the sentence.
Precisely. And this alternative view doesn't necessarily rule out deremodality, the idea that things themselves can be possible or necessary.
So there's still room for debate, which is good. Keeps things interesting.
It does. Now let's shift gears one last time and explore William's ethical framework, his ideas about what makes actions right or wrong.
Okay, ethics. Now, I know that medieval ethics was heavily influenced by both Greek philosophy and Christian theology. What were William's main sources?
He drew on both, but he seems to have been particularly influenced by the Neoplatonists and by Augustine.
So a blend of classical and Christian ideas.
Exactly. And he starts with two fundamental claims that were pretty widely accepted in his time.
Okay, what are these foundational claims?
The first is that evil is not a positive entity in itself, but rather a privation of good.
So evil is like a lack, an absence of something that should be there.
Right. It's not a force in its own right, but a kind of deficiency or corruption of goodness.
And the second claim?
The second is that everything that happens in the world is either directly performed or at least permitted by God, and is therefore good in some ultimate sense.
So even the bad stuff is ultimately part of God's plan.
That's the idea. Now, these two claims create a bit of a puzzle when it comes to ethics.
How so?
Well, if evil is just a lack of good, and everything is ultimately good in God's plan, then where does moral responsibility fit in?
That's a tough one. If everything is ultimately from God, how can we be held accountable for our actions?
Exactly. And this is where William's theory of moral psychology comes in.
Okay, so he's trying to explain how humans can be moral agents within this framework of divine providence.
He is. And he identifies three key elements in our moral makeup: vice, desire, and will.
Vice, desire, and will. Let's unpack those one by one. What's vice for William?
He sees vice as an inborn disposition or inclination towards certain actions.
So it's like a tendency we're born with, not necessarily something we choose.
Right. And he's careful to say that vice in itself isn't necessarily morally bad. It only becomes blameworthy if we consent to it, if we let it guide our actions.
So we're not responsible for our inclinations, but we are responsible for how we act on them.
Exactly. Now, desire, especially sexual desire, gets a much more negative treatment from William.
I've heard he was pretty strict when it came to matters of the flesh.